When we think of the most fearsome predators in history, it's common to imagine the famous T-Rex and vast oceans filled with sea monsters like the gigantic mosasaur or creatures that could fuel our nightmares, as we talked about in our video on thalassophobia. But there was an era where the real danger wasn't in the ocean depths, but on land. During this unique moment in our planet's history, the oceans were a relatively safe haven, while surviving on land was the real challenge. At this time, the land was home to some of the most brutal predators that ever existed. Today we are going to explore one of those moments, a period that occurred right before the end of a geological era known as the Permian. More specifically, we'll be talking about the Lopingian, the last stage of this period. This name might not ring a bell, but get ready because the world was completely different back then. Imagine a completely different Earth from the one we know today. We are in the Lopingian, around 259 million years ago, and not only was the geography different, but even the days were shorter. They lasted barely 22 hours as the moon orbited much closer to the Earth. This proximity affected the tides, the cycles of light and darkness, and life itself on the planet. As for geography, the Earth was dominated by a supercontinent called Pangaea. This massive landmass united what we now know as Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and parts of Europe. These modern continents were crammed together into a single landmass that extended across the southern hemisphere and was mostly connected toward the west and center of the planet. Only to the east could you find somewhat more scattered lands, like what we now know as Siberia, Kazakhstan, and northern China, which formed a kind of super island. Further south, another island consisted of southern China and several regions of Southeast Asia. And if that wasn't enough, what we now know as Turkey, Iran, and Tibet were also islands surrounded by the Tethys and Paleotethys oceans. These seas were large, but nothing compared to the true giant of the era, Panthalassa, the superocean. Panthalassa was immense. It occupied more than 60% of the Earth's surface, making it more than twice the size of the current Pacific Ocean. Imagine that, an ocean so vast it seemed infinite, covering most of the planet. Sailing in its waters would have been a terrifying experience, as its overwhelming size and unpredictable currents made this sea a true force of nature. Along its coasts and in its depths, marine life had been evolving for millions of years. And although you might expect to find giant and fierce creatures dominating these seas, the truth is that by this time the waters were relatively calm. However, this was not always the case. Over 200 million years ago, sharks had already begun to swim in Earth's oceans, and one of the most impressive sharks that ever existed was the helicoprion. This incredible predator measured about 8 meters long and possessed a jaw as strange as it was lethal. Its spiral-shaped teeth grew in its lower jaw, giving it a terrifying and unique appearance in the world of sharks. During the Permian period, this shark had become one of the most iconic creatures of the seas. However, by the time we reached the Lopingian, the helicoprion had already gone extinct. The oceans which once housed these giants were now more empty in terms of massive predators. Nevertheless, some smaller relatives of the helicoprion still swam in the waters. One of them was the hybidus, a much smaller shark, only 2 meters long, somewhat like a modern leopard shark. Despite its size, its teeth were not made to crush bones, but rather to hunt softer prey, like squids and other invertebrates. Other sharks of the time, like the Sphenacanthus and the hybidonts, were even smaller, barely reaching 1.5 meters long. This contrasts sharply with the monstrous sharks we tend to imagine. These small marine hunters were not a threat to larger animals, as they specialized in smaller soft-bodied prey. During the Devonian, an era preceding the Permian, the oceans were full of giant sea scorpions, known as eurypterids, which dominated the seas and were fearsome predators. However, by the Lopingian, these giants had fallen from grace. The Devonian mass extinction had drastically reduced their numbers, and by the late Permian, only a couple of genera survived, none of which were large or dominant enough to be considered apex predators. These sea scorpions were like ghosts of a glorious past, survivors of an era when they ruled the seas. Now, they were merely a shadow of what they once were. What caused this decline in marine life? One of the main reasons why life in the oceans of the Lopingian was so unimpressive in terms of size and diversity was the capitanian extinction. This extinction event, which occurred about 2 million years earlier, was devastating for marine life. In fact, it was even deadlier than the famous Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, which wiped out the dinosaurs and the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. The capitanian was particularly harsh on marine species, wiping out many and leaving the oceans of the Lopingian relatively empty. Nevertheless, some creatures survived. Trilobites, those ancient arthropods that once dominated the oceans, still roamed the waters, although in much smaller numbers and sizes than in previous eras. The same happened with ammonites, those spiral-shelled mollusks that would also have been common in the seas of the late Permian. While life in the Lopingian Ocean seemed to have caught a break after the capitanian extinction, the situation on land was completely different. The extinction had hit hard, but curiously, life on land recovered much more quickly, and instead of weakening, became even more dangerous. This happened because the ancient rulers of the land, a group of animals known as Dinocephalians, disappeared, leaving a power vacuum. This empty space at the top of the food chain was quickly filled by new predators and herbivores that would mark the end of the Permian period. Dinocephalians were a group of large, highly diverse, and successful therapsids during much of the early and middle Permian, but despite their success, they did not survive until the end of the period. With their disappearance, other species had the opportunity to rise and dominate, with the gorgonopsids being the ones who benefited the most from this opportunity. Gorgonopsids are a fascinating group of prehistoric predators. They were discovered by paleontologists in 1876, and their appearance was so terrifying that they were named after the Gorgons from Greek mythology, monsters with a petrifying gaze. Though the gorgonopsids were diverse, they shared several common features: deeply rooted teeth, a parasagittal gait, which means their legs moved directly under their body, giving them greater stability and speed, long and narrow skulls, and most notably elongated, sharp incisors and canines, making them some of the first saber-toothed predators in Earth's history. These long-toothed predators might remind you of the famous saber-toothed cats, like Smilodon, but it's important to clarify something. They were not felines. In fact, they weren't even mammals. Gorgonopsids were therapsids, a group of vertebrates that were more closely related to mammals than to reptiles, but they were not yet mammals themselves. Like their predecessors, the Dinocephalians, these predators were expert hunters that lived throughout much of the Permian period, first appearing around 265 million years ago in the middle of this geological period. When they first appeared, gorgonopsids were small. Some were so tiny that they didn't exceed the size of a human foot. In those days, they hunted small creatures like amphibians and reptiles, which meant they were far from the feared super predators they would later become. As the millions of years passed, gorgonopsids evolved, becoming increasingly larger. This process accelerated greatly towards the end of the Permian period, after the disappearance of the Dinocephalians. Of all the gorgonopsids, one stands out as the largest of all time, Inostrancevia. This predator was not only the biggest of its species, but also the largest land predator of the late Permian. Fossil evidence suggests that some adult Inostrancevia specimens could have reached 3.5 meters or 11.5 feet in length and weighed more than 450 kilograms, around 1,000 pounds, comparable to a large bear. However, most individuals were probably closer in size to a modern tiger. Unlike smaller gorgonopsids, Inostrancevia was not only bigger, but also better adapted for hunting. Its limbs were long and robust, giving it surprising endurance and speed, which allowed it to hunt a wide variety of medium and large herbivores. Once Inostrancevia caught its prey, it had little chance of escaping. Its post-canine teeth were long and curved, and its upper canines measured around 15 centimeters or 6 inches, making them some of the largest teeth seen in non-mammalian therapsids. In addition to being long, these teeth were sharp and serrated, allowing them to slice through prey's flesh with ease, causing massive blood loss and severe damage to vital organs. Before we continue, if you like what you are watching, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future content. It really helps support the channel and keeps us bringing you more quality content videos like this one. Now, let's get back to it. Though it's clear that Inostrancevia was an extremely lethal hunter, it's not entirely clear how it hunted. There are two main theories. The first suggests it may have used a tactic similar to that of Smilodon, attacking the prey's neck to quickly immobilize it. The second theory suggests that Inostrancevia may have adopted a bite and retreat approach, biting the prey and then waiting for it to die from blood loss and shock. Regardless of the method it used, encountering Inostrancevia was not a pleasant experience. This predator had a wide geographic geographic range, spanning what is now Africa, Asia, and European Russia. Inostrancevia was not only a killing machine, but also a highly adaptable creature, as it could be found in a variety of very different biomes, from the warm floodplains of South Africa to the cold deserts of Russia. Having a giant gorgonopsid like Inostrancevia roaming both hemispheres of Earth was terrifying enough, but the reality is that the late Permian was home to many more gorgonopsids, especially in the region we now know as Russia. In this part of the world, the remains of dozens of gorgonopsid species have been found, including some smaller ones like Pravoslavlevia and medium-sized ones like Suchogorgon. This abundance of gorgonopsids meant that, in many regions, they were the dominant predators. For the herbivores of that time, no matter their size, there was always a gorgonopsid lurking in the shadows, ready to hunt. This made Permian Russia one of the most dangerous places on Earth during that era. In Africa, a whole subfamily of giant gorgonopsids evolved independently alongside Inostrancevia. This subfamily was known as the rubidgeinae. Although Inostrancevia was the largest gorgonopsid individually, the rubidgeinae were, on average, the largest family and were distinguished by some notable characteristics. Their skulls were especially robust, lacking the parasphenoid bone, a skull structure common in other vertebrates. They frequently replaced their teeth, and their deeply serrated teeth were likely even more effective at cutting through flesh than those of Inostrancevia. In addition to their impressive teeth, the rubidgeinae were also stocky creatures. Some species, like Rubidgeinae atrox, which inhabited what is now South Africa and Tanzania, could reach up to 3 meters, 10 feet in length, making them apex predators. However, what truly made Rubidgeinae a formidable creature was its skull. It accounted for more than 15% of its total body length, and recovered skulls showed that they were extremely thick and featured signs of bossing, bony protrusions that suggest this predator was designed to bite and battle large, powerful prey. Despite their terrifying appearance, Rubidgeinae shared an evolutionary curiosity with Smilodon, which would live 250 million years later. Both lacked a particularly strong bite. Reconstructions suggest that Rubidgeinae had a bite force of about 715 newtons, only 20% more powerful than that of a modern wolf. This only underscores how well designed their teeth were for piercing thick flesh and skin with ease. If Rubidgeinae had been the only gorgonopsid in its habitat, it would have already disrupted the balance of the entire ecosystem on its own, but unfortunately for other creatures, it was almost never alone. The Rubidgeinae subfamily was composed of at least 9 different genera, all medium to large in size. Worse still, according to indirect evidence, Rubidgeinae likely coexisted with Inostrancevia in the same territory, as both had a presence in southern Africa during the late Permian. Given their similar size and comparable physical traits, it is likely that both predators shared the same ecological niche, which would have led to frequent conflicts between them. In short, during this era, Earth was truly the planet of the gorgonopsids, whose dominant presence on land made the water seem like a safer option for herbivores. However, gorgonopsids weren't the only terrifying predators of the late Permian. This era was also home to other hunters that, while less well known, were equally fearsome. One of the most important groups was the Therioscephalians, another type of therapsid that emerged during the Middle Permian. Unlike gorgonopsids, Therioscephalians did not reach such large sizes during this era. Nonetheless, they were much more geographically widespread, with species found in Russia, Antarctica, Africa, and China. Although a small number of Therioscephalians were herbivores, the vast majority were predators. In fact, some of them could easily be mistaken for gorgonopsids at first glance, as they also had large skulls and robust bodies. However, there were key differences. Therioscephalians tended to have wider and deeper skulls, smaller and straighter teeth, more compact bodies, and a greater diversity of forms and sizes. This diversity allowed some to develop unique hunting techniques not seen in gorgonopsids, as is believed to have been the case with Ictiosuscio and Eucambersia, 2 Therioscephalians about the size of a dog that may have been venomous. If this is true, they would be the first tetrapods in history to develop venom as a hunting weapon. Of all the Therioscephalians, the most notable was Muscerinus, a predator the size of a jaguar, but with a disproportionately large head, more comparable to that of a lion. Its conical and sharp teeth suggest it had a relatively strong bite, and paleontologists believe it hunted its prey by immobilizing it with its powerful forelimbs, before biting with its sharp teeth and powerful jaws. Muscerinus was one of the most abundant Therioscephalians of the late Permian, and one of the few predators that were not gorgonopsids to have reached apex apex predator status. In fact, in certain environments, Inostrancevia may have even displaced gorgonopsids as the dominant predator. In the vast European Russia during the first half of the Lopingian, a creature known as Megawaio roamed as one of the largest predators in the region. This distant relative of Inostrancevia reached up to 3 meters in length and weighed 9 tons, making it the largest therocephalian ever discovered. Based on coprolites, fossilized feces, we know that its diet likely consisted of large Theriodonts, which it may have killed using venom. In fact, some studies on its skull suggest that in life it may have had a venom gland and several ducts capable of injecting lethal amounts of venom into its prey with a single bite. However, because the remains of its prey are often found in poor condition, this hypothesis has not been fully accepted by the paleontological community. The late Permian wasn't just a time dominated by therocephalians and gorgonopsids, it was also filled with other predators with unusual appearances and characteristics. For example, the proterosuchids, reptiles that at first glance resembled crocodiles but had long needle-like teeth. These hunters were reptiles unlike the therapsids and were found on almost every continent except North America and Antarctica. Some were entirely terrestrial, while others adapted to a semi-aquatic lifestyle. Another peculiar group was the crocodilomorphs, such as Chronosuchia, which also had a crocodile-like appearance but with bony armor along their backs. This additional protection likely helped them defend against attacks from large therapsids. Despite the fierce competition among predators, herbivores not only survived but thrived in the late Permian. Across the vast territories of Pangaea, herbivores were surprisingly more diverse than their carnivorous counterparts and had developed a variety of adaptations to defend themselves. One of the most well-known herbivores was Lystrosaurus, a creature the size of a badger or a pig, which was one of the most abundant animals of the time. Although it had a somewhat strange appearance, it should not be underestimated. It had powerful forelimbs and tusks that it likely used to dig deep burrows, providing the necessary protection against predators. Moreover, digging wasn't an exclusive skill of the Dicynodonts, as other groups like the Cynagnathidae had also learned to dig, using their broad skulls to move large amounts of dirt. At the other end of the spectrum were the Pariasaurs, which evolved into living tanks, similar to ankylosaurs, though without the club tails. These herbivores were covered in large bony plates, and their bones were extremely dense, providing additional protection against predators. The most famous member of this family, Scutosaurus, weighed more than 1.2 tons and was as large as the great gorgonopsids. Its heavy and slow body relied almost entirely on its armor for protection. Additionally, it had bony spikes on its skull and muscles so dense they were practically impenetrable. Although Scutosaurus was only found in Russia, the Pariasaur family had a global distribution. Unlike the Mesozoic, which was home to enormous pterosaurs capable of hunting dinosaurs, the Permian had no such giants patrolling the skies. Although griffinflies and paleotic Teopterans could give you quite a scare, they were harmless to large animals and were neither very abundant nor diverse due to the collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests. The late Permian had one final trick up its sleeve: nature itself. If you followed along so far, you'll have noticed that life seemed concentrated in just a few regions, mainly in European Russia and Africa. This was because large stretches of land were practically uninhabitable, with average temperatures estimated at 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, double the current heat. This oppressive heat contributed to severe aridity, which plagued the supercontinent and resulted in massive deserts near the equator where life was practically non-existent. Worse still, in the north lay the central Permian mountain range, an extensive chain that stretched across the continent horizontally, creating areas prone to terrible droughts. To put this into perspective, if such conditions appeared today, life would face a drastic recession. And the most incredible thing is that this climate, though terrifying, was relatively tolerable for the late Permian. If you had survived until about 252 million years ago, you would have witnessed the Earth transform into an apocalyptic wasteland due to the late Permian mass extinction, known as the Great Dying, a name that truly fits. This extinction event is known as the most devastating in Earth's history, far more so than the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. It is believed that this apocalypse began with the eruptions of the Siberian Traps, a massive region of volcanic rock in Siberia area the size of Western Europe. These eruptions, incomparable to anything humanity has witnessed, devastated the planet. Lava flows reached up to a kilometer thick and released massive amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur, further heating the surface. In some areas, it is thought that the average yearly temperature reached levels similar to Death Valley's average temperature during its hottest month. And if somehow you were resistant to the extreme heat, you would still have likely died of suffocation, as the gases released drastically reduced oxygen levels, triggering multiple hypoxic events. As if all of this wasn't enough, some studies suggest that the eruption severely damaged the ozone layer, increasing ultraviolet radiation by more than 5,000% in some regions. Although there is debate about how long these effects lasted, we know that in the end, the Earth was a very different place. 57% of all biological families and 83% of genera went extinct. By comparison, the KT extinction, which wiped out the dinosaurs, only wiped out 17% of biological families. Curiously, while the situation on land was terrible, marine life suffered even more due to rising water temperatures and acidification. But if you had ventured into the water, you wouldn't have burned. In fact, you might have enjoyed it, as ocean temperatures during this event are believed to have been similar to those of a hot tub. So during this apocalyptic time, being in the water was definitely a better option than being on land. That's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, leave your like and subscribe to support me to create more content. See you soon in the next video.